administration that would like to double them in the next few years. When you look at exports in terms of exports minus imports, the net exports, that number is relatively low. So from my point of view, what is critical is what happens with investment. And as you can see, it's declining. And what you see with consumption. And it's still high up all over there. So this growth model worked in the past, but may not work so well in the future without significant structural changes. What about the present situation of the deficit? If you look at the numbers, of the deficit numbers, 10 years ahead, what you will find is that there is a serious potential for economic crisis coupled with political division. Division by two major parties, but also within those parties. What could be done? A very simple answer. If you look at where the money goes, in the next decade, I think the 50% of the debt numbers have to do with wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. But the key measure, the key indicator, the Bush tax cuts. If those would be phased out, the deficit would be 50% of what it is today, 40 to 50%. And I remember prior to the elections how so many Democrats spoke very strongly against the Bush tax cuts, but perhaps for political reasons were unwilling to phase them out. There was concern about the political support in the United States. The question is, what will happen next? Will those tax cuts will they be phased out? From my point of view, they do not support the economy, but they certainly support polarization in the United States. What about then the US deficit? Who actually pays for it? And the dollar. If we look at the national debt, today, a little bit less than maybe 5-10 years ago, about 40% is being supported by major foreign holders. And the role of China in that is less than half of it. Significant, but not primary. It has to do with the rest of the world, China, and the oil-producing countries. The question is, how long are they willing to do this? China and the US are in the symbiotic relationship. Whatever one does will affect the other. Will this hold? Secondly, if we look at China's foreign reserve composition, this is a picture that most of my friends love to show, especially in the Chinese think tanks, because if you ask them what is their greatest concern, they will always tell you it's the dollar. Would it be more reasonable to invest in our country? Dollar will be depreciating, renminbi will be appreciating. What is the sense in this? The sense is political, the sense is to some extent also economic, and there are arguments to be made that very deep relation between these two is actually very positive in the long run. I'm one of those who believes very strongly in that. So all of these factors together, when you factor them in, you find the reason for the outlook downgrade by Standard & Poor's. From their point of view, this means that there's a 1 to 3rd, about 30–35% chance that they may have further downgrades. That would depend very much on whether there is bipartisan agreement on measures to have a credible path out from the deficit-driven growth that the United States has had for such a long time. Now, I think one motivation that Standard & Poor's had was that they had to look at what happened in Canada, France, England, UK. There you do have plans. Now, we can debate whether they make sense or not, but they do have plans, and there are arguments to be made that they are credible plans to cut the deficit. The same development, for now at least, hasn't been apparent in the United States, and that's a source of great concern. Now, if you look at other reasons perhaps for the sovereign credit risk in the United States, and you look at some recent research, it's very interesting. If you look at the national level, there you have USA all the way down, very close to Germany. But look at the level of states, and you will find that not too far from Greece, you have California and Michigan. Not too far from Ireland, where President Obama is today, or was yesterday, is Illinois, New Jersey, New York, and Nevada. Not too far from Portugal, you have Florida. Not too far from Spain, you have Ohio. But due to the nature of the federal state, due to the nature of the economy, the pressures, the risk pressures aren't as high as what you might see in Europe, where the integration, in some ways, when you look at the integration in political terms, has begun very recently in terms of history. So there are very difficult decisions to be made in the United States in the near future. A lot of people were very uneasy on May the 16th, not just 2 or 3 days ago when we were supposed to have that end of the world, but May 16th, because that was the day when the US hit the $14.3 trillion debt limit. And the question was, what next? The Secretary of Treasury, Mr. Geithner, was able to rely on suspension that should allow the US to avoid a default before August the 2nd or 8th. However, even if there is a way to resolve in a bipartisan way this stalemate situation politically, and even if there is a way to move ahead in economic terms, you still have the structural problem of the aging population. And that will really hit the United States starting around 2015. Of course, it has already started with the boomers retiring, but with the full force will be felt 2 or 3 or 4 years ago. Now imagine if there had not been those wars. Imagine if there had not been Bush tax cuts. The position would have been better, better positioned for the future. Now it's a bit more complicated. Although I spent 25 years in the US, 5 years more and more in Asia, I initially come from Europe and from Nordic Europe. Many American friends of mine consider their healthcare systems to be sort of socialistic. But there's one thing that's typical to them. They cost 50% less than the American system. So you really have to start thinking about these problems in advance and the structural solutions, even as you're fighting with the cyclical problems. And that takes us to the following slide. If we look at the near-term growth of the United States under these circumstances, and this is based on the idea that we don't have very disruptive developments in positive terms or negative terms. And that means that this development will be, the growth will be better than what we might see in Europe and what we might see in Japan. But if you compare that with the developing countries, it will be only half of it or less. Now, finally, if we look in structural terms, what this all means, the structural rebalancing that we talked about and most of you believe in, if America consumed of its, the consumption accounted for the GDP about 72–74% prior to this crisis, it has changed a little bit, but not much. And if you compare that with personal saving, that certainly took off and has increased a lot. But if you look at the levels of early 1980s, in other words, prior to the low interest rates, prior to the great development towards the Washington Consensus starting in the late 1980s, we are very far from the situation that prevailed in the mid-1980s, where the consumption played a smaller role in the United States. Manufacturing had a greater role, so did personal savings. And if you look at long-term projections, you will find that the role of the United States in the next 2 decades will be half of what it is or was last year. That does not mean that US is declining. It means that its role, its position in the world economy is declining. But what will happen to the US and its growth prospects, I believe very strongly, the most immediate test will be what happens prior to August the 2nd or 8th. And the longer term, or the medium-term test will be what happens in the next elections. And the long-term prospect will be how can we resolve healthcare system under these conditions where we really have to cut significantly costs in order to avoid the structural erosion that is bound to follow after the 2015 without significant change. Thank you very much.